All right, it finally worked. We're live on Facebook. uh, I just wanted to welcome our guest today. It's John Clare. John is a radio DJ with Sirius XM Pandora Classical Station and St. Louis. Remind me the call letters one more time.
It's KNOU HD2, and known as Classic 107.3 here in St. Louis.
I want to just first off thank you for talking with me today, and you know, I've been learning. It's just been really exciting for me talking to all these old former WSU students and seeing where their paths have taken them. And your pathway, I think, is a unique one because it's a great sort of picture into that. Not every career in music is playing music or writing music necessarily or teaching music. There's like other things we can do. So I'm interested to hear your perspective. To start, if you could just tell me a little bit about your background as a musician and what brought you to Wichita State and what was your major and all that stuff.
Sure. Well, Alex, I'm so tickled to be here, and I loved Wichita State and my time there. And I actually grew up outside of Wichita in Derby, Kansas. We moved there. My dad took a job at Boeing after retiring from the Air Force. And so soon after that, I began playing violin and ended up taking private lessons and just loving the violin, and spent many years there. And at the time, I decided I wanted to learn from Andre Gravietz, who was there for many years. And before that, I'd actually studied, in my first semesters at Wichita State, were taking applied lessons from Nancy Luttrell. And
Yeah.
I got to see her and Catherine Concilio and a bunch of folks this last summer at Chamber Music at the Barn. I came out and did a concert talk. And this year, if they're going to be able to continue their season, we'll see what happens. They've told me tentatively July we may be able to. I'll be narrating some pieces out there. Yeah, so that's kind of fun. So I loved the violin and ended up starting as a composition major. And studying with Catherine Murdoch and Walter Mays, who I both stay in touch with, and I know Walter's still there, which is wonderful. So I kind of came about it, and there were different choices, but I really thought, this was a great violin program, and I just thought when I grew up, I thought, I'd seen Perlman come and play, and I saw Isaac Stern come play Beethoven Concerto with the Wichita Symphony, and I thought, oh, this is a great path. Never thinking I would be a broadcaster, never thinking I would be on the radio, or now, 26, 27 years later, be running a radio station in St. Louis, Missouri.
Yeah.
And I tell you what, it happened at Dirksen Fine Arts Center. There was one summer where I didn't go off to Brevard or go visit friends. I never went to Aspen, but I had friends and teachers there.
Yeah.
But there was one summer where I didn't go, and there was a student position open up at KMUW. And I ended up working in the music library and studied and did stuff. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. I'd listened to KMUW. I knew public radio, but hadn't really thought about it. And sure enough, I got a position being the local host for Performance Today, which only means I was on the air like 2 minutes an hour. But yeah. I'd been on the pledge drive. There was a bass player there, Josh Pickenpaugh, who had a jazz show and had me on fundraising. And so I'd been a member and whatnot. So I got my foot in the door there, and one thing led to another, and I ended up becoming a full-time announcer and producer there. It led to a little stint at NPR for just a little bit. I filled in producing the St. Louis Symphony, of all things. I was reminded of that at the job interview here. But it was just a funny path that I ended up. I always remembered we built our own house out near Rose Hill. My parents did. They had 5 acres out there, and I remember one winter day we were inside. The house still wasn't finished, but we had the radio on, and I remember hearing Copland's Third Symphony, and it just blew my mind. And there was this great fanfare for the Common Man that came on at the end, and I just sat there. I wasn't hammering or anything. I just was listening to this music. And I think about that now as a broadcaster, that there are people who've never heard Copland Third Symphony. There are people that have never heard Eine kleine Nachtmusik or never heard Pachelbel Canon. And I think about that powerful moment as a teenager, hearing Copland's score and falling in love with it. So I guess that was one of the things that led me to radio. But ultimately, it was like, oh wow, it was. I tell people now it's far easier to talk about Bach than play Bach.
Amen. Yeah. That story about Copeland, I think, I think that can relate for a lot of us. I know, it's funny. I discovered classical music really late in my life. I didn't really come to classical music until high school. But it was sort of a similar kind of thing where I decided I wanted to learn something about classical music. So I rode my bike to the local record store and I went to the section where, they sold the classical music, and there was a guy in charge of stocking the classical music section. I said, I listen to a lot of rock music. And I said, this is what I'm listening to. What do you recommend? And so he gave me Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And he also gave me Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. And
two very dissimilar pieces.
Yeah. And I remember I put in Rite of Spring first, and the chords, when the chords started, I went, oh, this is just rock music for orchestra, right? And then when I heard the Young Person's Guide at the very end, when you've got the big fugue, but then the chorale on top of it, sort of just like Copland, just like it didn't make sense to me. And I think that's an important sort of this lesson that there is something about this discovery, right? That is so exciting and we've got that power to sort of, the first time you hear a piece of music that you're not familiar with, that it can be really exciting. So that Copeland story resonates strongly with me. I'm sure it's going to resonate with a few people watching as well. Before we get into sort of the radio career, which I'm fascinated by, you were a composition major at WSU, and you studied with Dr. Murdoch and Dr. Mays. What started you on that pathway versus a performance degree or an education degree?
I think I'd seen, this is so corny, I'd seen Amadeus, and
Yeah.
that was my sophomore year, '86, in high school, and so it was a big impact, and I loved it, and I loved to improvise. I would play a little bit piano, which I'm horrible at, but I'd like to improvise on violin. And my very first private teacher was Les Morrison, who wrote out some violin etudes for me of his own. I had all these other things, and I didn't appreciate it at the time. But now I look back and go, "Wow, it was so cool to see his manuscript that wasn't, printed on the page."
Right.
And so it was one of those things I'd taken, besides taking applied music ahead of time in high school, getting lessons from Nancy Lettrell. I ended up taking the theory courses during the summer of my junior and senior year. So Katie Murdoch was my first theory teacher, and then and all skills, and then Russ Widener was the theory 2 the following summer. And so when I began as a freshman, I was already in all skills and theory 3 with Dr. Mays, and I could hit the, I was in high school, I would go into the music library there and check out the Symphonie Fantastique and get the recording, because we were playing March to the Scaffold at high school, just that movement. But I wanted to know the whole thing, and I heard about, all this stuff, and I was constantly reading, and I was reading Goethe, and all these, very romantic things. So it was just feeding me. And so that idea of composition, and I just go up in the stacks. My first gig at the School of Music was in the music library, and I just loved going up there and looking at all the reserve scores and all these different things that were just there, and I could go in on a Saturday morning and no one would be around. And I remember I'd gotten a recording of a violin winner and put it on, and it was an LP, and I thought it was skipping because it kept on repeating. Well, it turned out it was a piece by Philip Glass, and I hadn't expected his piece. So that was my introduction to minimalism, in the fall of '88. So I was just fascinated by new music, and I think Katie Murdoch really fed my need for that, and sort of the drop the needle tests and whatnot. So My freshman year, I went in every day and listened to a new piece of music. The first
Yeah.
year, every day I went in, and this is time of LPs, and they were just starting to get CDs. And so, each day I'd go up and get a score and a piece of music. And it started with her 20th century music list, but, I went in and started looking at my own stuff and asking folks, what should I listen to? So I think that's how my love of composition came about.
Yeah. I think the thing that I want to just highlight, I think is so important for all of our students who might be watching, is this importance of just curiosity. And, I mean, as a professor, there's only so much time in the day to like explore, to expose you to repertoire. And so, imagine we do one piece a week, that's only 16 pieces you could learn in a semester, but there's just so much music out there. So this idea of just like, yeah, I'm just going to walk in and pull off a score and pull up a recording. And I think it's really important to our growth as a musician. So I want to fast forward a little bit and talk about your career in radio. So, well, boy, I have so many questions about this, but I'll start. Let's start here. We'll start a little bit in the future, what's going on right now, but then I kind of want to rewind a little bit as well. But so I know that the radio industry is changed dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. And maybe even longer than that. And I'm just sort of curious as someone who's running a classical radio station and also DJs for a classical radio station, what are some of the challenges that you see in that genre of radio right now that you're running into?
So now it's that there's Sirius XM Pandora, there's public radio, there's YouTube, there's so many different ways to get music, and that's the greatest thing, and it's the hardest thing because content is everywhere. And so it's good for a composer, it's good for a young musician. Early on, when I started talking to composers, and sort of it's always been a little bit of my mission to share new music on the radio, is that a lot of composers suggest starting your own band. If you want to write music, you need to hear it. And if you need to hear it, well, if you don't have a band, or you don't have, you're not a virtuoso pianist, you need to make friends with those sort of musicians. And so that's the sort of thing that it's a challenge for me. There's so many new releases. How can I listen to a new Beethoven 5? How can I listen to a new, newly recorded Gretzky piece or a repaired piece? Finding the hours in the day as a broadcaster to know what's out there. I was chuckling today. I recorded tomorrow's Sirius XM shift, and it ends with John Rutter's Sweet Antique. And I recorded right here, not in Powell Hall. I have a virtual background, but I'm in my basement. We just moved here outside of St. Louis. And so as I'm walking up from the basement this morning, I'm kind of singing to myself, da, 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 da. I'm singing the waltz from this John Rutter piece. And I've known it so long and so well. And I talked to Rutter, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, is the last time I interviewed him. And he had told me the story. And so, it was really fun to be a part of that. You think about the music and it's going on in your head, but it's so hard to find the time to learn new things and to know the latest version. So it's a great challenge. It's a hard problem. It's sort of a first world problem, but at the same time, you want to be unique. Sirius XM offers something to someone across the country. 107.3, here locally, we do a lot of arts interviews with our partners, the St. Louis Symphony and Opera Theater St. Louis. Now working with them to, when in this age of coronavirus, what do you do? Sharing musicians performing at home, talking. I've been doing a series talking to the CEOs. It's kind of like a farmer's market. You kind of want the fresh local music. So it's awesome to have sort of that Wichita sound and Mark Foley's and Craig Owens and all these, cool cats that are there doing their own thing. And to hear that, and then, a Seattle sound and an LA sound and that sort of thing. So you want that great local sound, and KMUW, Radio Kansas are awesome stations there. And I take a look at them now and then. but to me, it's keeping up with the content and knowing who's got that great Beethoven five out there and who's the next. I tell you, I love Missy Mazzoli. There's so
Yeah.
many up and coming composers. I met Christina Spinay out of Nashville, and she's a great voice who writes a lot of cool sort of dance music.
Yeah.
It's really awesome.
Something that you just said made me realize too. So I've been a Sirius subscriber since it was just Sirius. I bought a lifetime subscription when it sort of first came out, which was one of the best investments I've made. And so I spent a lot of time listening to that. But this is not to knock them, but one of the things about the local stations that you're pointing out is and why I think it's important for us to continue to listen to local radio is it connects us with our community. Sirius XM Classical is not going to necessarily be interviewing the St. Louis Symphony or members of the St. Louis Symphony or the Wichita Symphony in our state. And so connecting with the local radio, I think, is an important part of just connecting with your own community. So I think that's important to highlight that. I'm curious from a programming point of view. So, if you talk to conductors, they find this challenge of programming. You program for the audience, and you want people to keep coming back. So that's why we're seeing all Beethoven cycles and all Mozart cycles, and we're going to shy a little away from contemporary music because we don't know how people are going to react. And some people are leaning into it, like Dudamel, Michael Tilson Thomas, from where I'm from, really leaned into contemporary music. Do you, as a programmer, do you feel this pressure to program the hits, or do you feel a sense of responsibility of like educating, your audience to music that they may not stumble across naturally? How do you balance those things?
It's hard, and I've changed over the years a lot, and it does deal a lot with market. We play a lot of Cindy McTee. We play a lot of Leonard Slatkin. We play a lot of Stefan Denev here in St. Louis because Cindy now lives in St. Louis. She's married to Leonard Slatkin, and so it's a natural to play a lot of Barbara Harbach because she taught at Missouri for years and for decades.
Yeah.
And I loved her music beforehand. I played a lot of it at Purdue, where I was at before this gig. And I think it's a little bit, we are in a great place because there are so many possibilities out there. It depends on who you're going for. So I think of it as sort of like Italian leather, Cuban cigars. You want the quality, and it doesn't matter if it's a 21st century piece. It doesn't matter if it's 18th century piece. You want the best performance. And for me here in St. Louis, it's a local tie. With Sirius XM, I don't program, but I help out with their new music show, and I certainly suggest things. And so, I'm out there. Tomorrow I'm going to talk to Shai Wasner, who's this wonderful pianist that plays crazy stuff like Xenakis and Stockhausen, but his main selling stuff is often Haydn, and his latest release is Schubert.
Right.
And I like to talk to him about both sides. And when I catch him tomorrow, I plan to say, oh, hey, I know you played some really great, Stockhausen with your last Haydn album. Who are you looking at now? So I try to work that in. It's hard. I see the value of playing the hits, but not for just that sake. We talked, as I was early on saying, oh, someone's maybe never heard Pachelbel Canon.
Right.
That's kind of crazy to think of, but they may not have. And there are people going, oh, gosh, not that again. So if you're going to play it, I think you play the best version you can, and the best might be a historically informed performance. It might be a great old Pyar recording.
Yeah.
And it kind of depends on what mood you're in. I listen to Lithium on Sirius XM because I kind of like 90s grunge. But I kind of check out what my colleagues sound like, and I listen to Polish radio, and I try to listen to things on YouTube that get recommended, and I'm all over the place. And I like Audible, but I've been reading Confederacy of Dunces because when we were unpacking a few days ago, I found my copy of it, and I was like, oh, I love this book. I'm going to reread it and actually read the book. So I've always believed in new music being present, and I love talking to the composer. These days, it's nice to take a little segment of a composer talking about, let's say Michael Torke talking about Sky that just was runner-up for a Pulitzer Prize. And he talks about this concerto and his relationship with the violinist. And I talked to him for about 15 minutes and made a nice little minute version of him introducing this piece. And it makes a little bit of entree to it. And it's one of his best pieces, I think. I think if you give that little bit of curiosity, people might check it out. And,
Yeah.
you know, I was program director in Austin, Texas for a couple of years. And the wonderful professor, I can see Donald Grantham.
Yeah.
Don Grantham was on the board, and he called me up my second week there, and he said, "What's playing on the radio right now?" And I said, I had to look, and I was like, "Oh, Lutoslawski Third Symphony." In all my life, I never imagined the station here playing Lutoslawski Third. Thank you so much. And I was like, I was scared, you know, at first, and then, you know, and it was one of those things. It's like, yeah, there's room for that. You know, when you're a radio station, you have 24 hours a day. It's sort of like a performance because it's fleeting, you know. And so having, you know, you might have someone that goes, "Oh, I'm not in the mood for that." You can't tell, you know, you have thousands of listeners out there. You can't tailor it for one. And so to me, it's sort of taste-making influencer is a term these days. You want to influence folks and give them a little bit of that hit and something maybe that they don't know and maybe might love.
I think that's great. That's a great viewpoint and a way to look at it. So let's rewind a little bit. So you got your first radio job at KMUW. So for someone who might be, you know, so let's say we've got a music student right now who's thinking, boy, I'd never thought about a broadcast career. And, you know, maybe they're a senior, so they can't go back and get a communications degree. What were some of the hurdles that you had to overcome? You know, that your music, you know, you had all this musical knowledge, but there's certainly some technical knowledge. So I don't know if you can give a snapshot into what that might look like for someone who wants to get into this industry, but doesn't have a communications degree or background.
I've always thought I was lucky because I was a little bit of a computer nerd besides a music nerd. And the digital transition sort of happened when I was going into radio. So I was lucky. There were still reel-to-reel tapes going on at KMUW, and DAT tapes were very big. But the digital realm was starting up. And so I had a digital editor. And I remember when we got a Mac with a grant and we had a CD burner, and it took longer than real time. I made an hour-long CD, and it took, I think, 3 hours to make. It was kind of like as the video rendering early on would take 3 hours for a 15-minute segment. Nowadays, it's so much quicker. So I was lucky that way. But I think listening to radio, kind of like you listen to music, you might listen to someone play a Brahms intermezzo, and you might listen to the transitions and how they pedal and how they, the lyricism and how they voice it. You might listen to the radio that way and say, "Oh, how did Steve Inskeep introduce that story?" Or, you know, how did that DJ set up that song? So, you know, it goes that way. These days, editing on your phone, editing video and audio is very close to one another. And again, listening to, why did the music come up here? A secret I have is that radio production, to me, is as satisfying as composing. And you have sort of maybe an introduction, whether that's spoken or written to the piece, and you have an introduction, sort of a theme, you know, it's sort of might follow sonata form. But, you know, there's this sort of golden mean part where maybe 2/3 of the way you hit the, you know, high point, and then you sort of, you know, have that coda and let down. To me, radio production has that, all those sort of interesting parts that it is something you go, when I'm interviewing someone, I'm like, that's what I'm starting with. Or, oh, I got to put that in there for sure, you know? So to me, it's as creative as music and almost as fun as performing. When you hit a break, you've done it in one take, you're like, yeah, you know? Like, oh man, I can't believe I fudged that one up, you know, oh, it's so out of tune. And there are days that you know, I you know, have my honey, I have my tea, you know, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, so To me, it's as satisfying as music, and that advice would be, listen to good radio, find what you like, and then a lot of radio stations need volunteers. They take interns. So even if you're a grad student wanting to get your foot in the door, listen, volunteer, check it out, because every public radio station, every classical station needs someone. And that's how, I started in the music library, getting
Yeah, yeah.
CDs, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. That's a great advice. Go just read. It's funny. Radio I think is the same way as sort of musicians in this way of um, I think they're generous with their time, and so if someone shows an interest in this field that we are so passionate about and says, "Hey, I might be interested in this," I think more often than not we're like, "Yes, please come on in. We'd be happy to show you how this works and give you some experience." So we just have a couple minutes left. So I just want to ask a couple. These are sort of my rounds of fun questions to really get to just know you a little bit. I won't. You don't have to name names if you don't want. But is there a piece of music that if you never had to hear it again, you'd be fine by that?
My least favorite composer is Richard Naines. Just a really, he was an awful composer from New Jersey, and there may be people that love him, but I just never could get into his music.
And have you ever gotten in trouble for programming something? I mean, the Don Grantham story almost went that direction, but have you ever had your
surprise ending, right?
Yeah, your program manager walk in?
In fact, the head of communications at the time, KMUW was, I don't know if they still are, but the School of Communications had Mike Wood, was a big name there at the time, and ran TV and radio and communications program. I was playing, it was a minimalist piece from an Argo release in the noon hour. I'd just become a DJ there, and early on, and I don't know if it was piano phase or if it was what it was, but it was off some of the release Piano Circus, and it was going on, it wasn't in C, but it was something not as cool as in C. But anyway, I got a call, and I ended up telling Mike, okay, and fading it down and saying that was whatever, let's go to, and something other. At the time I was mortified, thought I'd be fired. I didn't, but that was early on. My first year.
I love that story. Yeah. I will tell you my first discovery into minimalism was Steve Reich, Music for 18 Musicians. When I came across it, I was too young to really listen to it. I put it in, and I put it in as background music, which was a huge mistake. And so as your story goes, like, I'm 30 minutes and I go, wait, has it changed? Like, and I didn't know anything about minimalist music. It's very bizarre. I like that piece a lot more now, but on the other side of the music you can't stand, is there a piece of music that you still feel every time you hear it, it still feels sublime and new and exciting to you?
There are so many. Lately I've been into Arvo Pärt, and the Spiegel and Spiegel, the Mirror and Mirror, just gets me every time. It's one I love to sit there and play. I can sit there and listen to it all day, and it's one that I can just, there's so many great recordings. Anna Kiko Myers and Lisa Badiashvili and folks. I think Daniel Hope's got a version that's just gets me right here. I'm a big Polish music nut, and I was fortunate enough to talk to Krzysztof Penderecki 3 times, twice in person, and see him in concert. And so his death recently has been just, the day before he passed, I was listening to his 3rd symphony while I was packing to move here. And it just is so powerful, such powerful music, that I adore his music.
He's such a great composer, was such a great composer. And I think he just is easy to pigeonhole. Everyone hears Threnody and just thinks that's it. And so, and don't get me wrong, I like Threnody actually for what it is. I think it's actually a very interesting and beautiful work. But the depth of his music is so amazing. All right, so
fun quick Wichita State University facts with Penderecki, who had come there in the 70s and befriended Walter Mays, but Phil Black is a dead ringer for Krzysztof Penderecki.
Yes, he
Yeah.
is.
So anyway, just a little side note.
That's like, I had never thought about that, but you are 100% right. Wow, I'll never look at Phil in a faculty meeting the same way again.
Sorry.
No, that's great. And then the last question, which I think is the most important one, as so many of us are staying home right now and cooking a lot more than we do. What are you having for dinner tonight?
Gosh, I think I'm having salad because I got some awesome chicken breasts to grill, and
Nice.
so I've got to grill these chicken breasts before I don't want them to expire. And so I've been into different salads. My wife likes a Southwest salad and different things, so it's a little surprising for me. I'd normally grill a burger or a steak or something
Yeah,
fun like that, but those chickens aren't going to cook themselves, so to speak.
that's right. Excellent. Well, John, I just want to thank you again for your time. It's been just a great pleasure to talk and learn more about you. So thank you for this, and I appreciate it greatly.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. I'm rarely on the telling side of this, so it's kind of fun to be interviewed. So you did
Yeah.
great.
Excellent. Well, thanks again. We will see you soon.
Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.